The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Ashworth mansion, casting golden light across the polished marble floors. Grace Thompson moved quietly through the grand hallway, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the cold stone. She carried a silver tray loaded with fine china cups and saucers, the kind that cost more than most people made in a month. Grace had worked for the Ashworth family for 3 years now. She knew every corner of this massive house, every creak in the floorboards, every spot that needed extra attention when cleaning. The Ashworths were wealthy beyond imagination. Old money, as they called it, the kind of wealth that had been passed down through generations, growing larger with each passing year. Mrs. Victoria Ashworth sat in her favorite chair in the drawing room, surrounded by 5 other ladies from high society. They were all dressed in expensive clothes, their jewelry sparkling in the afternoon light. These women met every Tuesday for tea and gossip. Grace had served them many times before and knew their routine well. "More tea, Mrs. Wellington?" Grace asked politely, approaching the woman with perfectly styled gray hair. "Yes, dear," Mrs. Wellington replied without looking up from her conversation. To these women, Grace was invisible, just part of the furniture, someone who brought tea and disappeared. Grace poured the tea carefully, listening to their chatter about charity events, vacation homes, and whose daughter was dating whom. She had learned long ago to keep her ears open and her mouth shut. The wealthy talked freely around the help, as if they couldn't hear or understand. "Victoria, dear," said Mrs. Patterson, a thin woman with sharp features, "tell us about this piano business I've been hearing about." Mrs. Ashworth's eyes lit up with excitement. She loved being the center of attention, especially when she had something interesting to share. "Oh, that. Well, you know how difficult it's been finding the right match for my Thomas." Grace almost smiled. She knew Thomas Ashworth well. He was Mrs. Ashworth's only son, a kind young man of 26 who spent most of his time reading books and writing music. He was nothing like his mother. Where she was loud and demanding, he was quiet and thoughtful. Where she cared about money and status, he cared about art and learning. "The boy is too particular," Mrs. Ashworth continued. "He's turned down every suitable girl I've introduced him to. Says he wants to marry for love, not money." "Can you imagine?" The other women laughed, shaking their heads as if Thomas had suggested something completely ridiculous. "So I've come up with a brilliant plan," Mrs. Ashworth announced, setting down her teacup with a satisfied smile. "A test, if you will." "What kind of test?" asked Mrs. Chen, leaning forward with interest. Mrs. Ashworth stood up and walked over to the grand piano that dominated one corner of the room. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway that had been in the family for decades. The black surface was polished to mirror perfection, and every key was perfectly tuned. "This piano," she said, running her hand along its smooth edge, "will help me find the perfect wife for Thomas." Grace continued serving tea, but her attention was completely focused on Mrs. Ashworth's words. She had always been drawn to that piano. Sometimes, late at night when the family was asleep, she would sneak into this room just to look at it. She never dared touch it, of course. That would be crossing a line she couldn't afford to cross. "I've decided that any young woman who wants to marry my son must first prove herself worthy," Mrs. Ashworth declared. "She must be able to play Chopin's Etude in C minor, Opus 10, number 12, the revolutionary etude." The women gasped. Even Grace, who knew little about classical music, recognized that this was a big deal from their reactions. "Victoria, that's one of the most difficult pieces ever written," exclaimed Mrs. Wellington. "Exactly." Mrs. Ashworth clapped her hands together. "Any woman who can master that piece will have proven she has the dedication, intelligence, and refinement worthy of the Ashworth name." Mrs. Patterson frowned. "But dear, what if no one can play it?" "Oh, someone will," Mrs. Ashworth said confidently. "My friend's daughter Rebecca has been studying piano for 15 years, and the Morrison girl Elizabeth just graduated from the conservatory. These young ladies have had the finest musical education money can buy." Grace felt a strange flutter in her chest. She thought about her grandmother, the woman who had raised her after her parents died. Grandma Ruth had been a piano teacher before Grace was born, though she rarely talked about those days. She had taught Grace to play on an old upright piano that barely stayed in tune. But oh, how that woman could make music come alive. "When will you hold this musical audition?" asked Mrs. Chen. "Next Friday evening," Mrs. Ashworth replied. "I'm hosting a dinner party. After we eat, Each young lady will have her chance to prove herself. The one who plays the piece successfully will have my blessing to marry Thomas. And if none of them can do it? Mrs. Wellington asked. Mrs. Ashworth laughed, a sound like tinkling bells. Then I suppose any woman in the city could try. Even the help! She gestured carelessly toward Grace, causing the other women to burst into laughter. Grace felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but she kept her expression neutral. She had learned long ago not to show her feelings around these people. They enjoyed making others feel small, and she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Can you imagine? Mrs. Patterson giggled. The cleaning lady trying to play Chopin. My word, Victoria, you do have such a sense of humor, Mrs. Wellington added, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. Grace finished serving the tea and quietly left the room, their laughter following her down the hallway. But as she walked toward the kitchen, their mocking words echoed in her mind. She thought about her grandmother's hands, how they moved across the keys like dancing butterflies. She remembered the hours they spent together at that old piano, Grandma Ruth teaching her scales and simple songs that gradually became more complex. Music isn't about having fancy things, Grandma Ruth used to say. It's about having something beautiful inside you that needs to come out. Grace had stopped playing after her grandmother died. There was no piano in her small apartment and no time for music in her busy life. But sometimes, late at night, her fingers would move against her pillow, playing silent melodies that only she could hear. As she reached the kitchen, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened. The way Mrs. Ashworth had dismissed the possibility of anyone but the wealthy girls succeeding bothered her more than it should have. It was as if the woman believed that talent and worth could only exist in people with money and status. Grace put the tea tray down and looked back toward the drawing room, where she could still hear the women chattering about the upcoming musical challenge. A small, dangerous thought began to form in her mind. What if Mrs. Ashworth was wrong? What if there was more than one way to prove someone's worth? The seed of an idea was planted, and Grace found herself wondering what would happen if someone unexpected stepped up to that beautiful piano next Friday night. 3 days had passed since the tea party, and Grace couldn't stop thinking about that piano. Every time she dusted the drawing room, her eyes would drift to the magnificent instrument. Every time she heard Mrs. Ashworth talking about the upcoming challenge, something stirred deep inside her chest. The Ashworth house was quiet now. It was nearly midnight and everyone had gone to bed hours ago. Grace should have been sleeping too. Her day started at 5 in the morning and she needed her rest. But tonight she found herself standing in her small room on the 3rd floor, staring at the ceiling and thinking about her grandmother. Grandma Ruth had died when Grace was 17. Before that, music had been the center of Grace's world. Every day after school, she would rush to her grandmother's tiny apartment and spend hours at the old piano. The keys were yellow with age and some of them stuck, but to Grace it was the most beautiful thing in the world. You have a gift, child, Grandma Ruth used to say. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise. But after her grandmother's death, Grace had to work to survive. There was no time for music, no money for lessons, and certainly no piano to practice on. She had buried that part of herself so deep that sometimes she forgot it existed at all. Until now. Grace slipped out of her room and made her way down the stairs. The house was completely dark except for the moonlight streaming through the tall windows. She knew every step, every creaky board to avoid. She had walked these halls hundreds of times. When she reached the drawing room, she stopped at the doorway. The piano sat in the corner like a sleeping giant. In the moonlight, it looked almost magical, its polished surface reflecting the silver light from outside. Grace took a deep breath and stepped inside. Her heart was beating so fast she was sure the sound would wake the entire house. This was crazy. If Mrs. Ashworth found her here, she would be fired immediately. She would lose her job, her small room, everything. But something stronger than fear was pulling her forward. She approached the piano slowly, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. When she reached the bench, she hesitated for a long moment. Then, very carefully, she lifted the cover that protected the keys. The piano keys gleamed in the moonlight, perfect and untouched. Grace sat down on the bench and placed her hands in her lap. She closed her eyes and tried to remember what it felt like to play. Her fingers tingled with the memory. Just once, she whispered to herself. Just to see if I remember. Grace placed her fingers on the keys and began to play. She started with something simple, a piece her grandmother had taught her when she was 12. The notes filled the room, soft and gentle at first. The piano was perfectly tuned, and each note rang clear and true. As she played, years of buried memories came flooding back. She remembered her grandmother's voice, patient and encouraging. She remembered the feeling of the music flowing through her, like she was channeling something beautiful from another world. The simple piece ended, but Grace's hands didn't stop. Almost without thinking, she began to play something more complex, a Bach invention that had taken her months to master. Her fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. The music grew louder, more confident. Grace forgot where she was, forgot the danger of being discovered. She was lost in the world she had abandoned 7 years ago, the world where she belonged. She began playing Chopin, pieces her grandmother had introduced her to in her final months. A nocturne, soft and dreamy, then a waltz, playful and light. Her fingers danced across the keys as if they had never stopped playing. Then, without fully realizing what she was doing, Grace began the opening notes of Chopin's Revolutionary Etude, the same piece Mrs. Ashworth had mentioned at the tea party, the piece that was supposed to be impossible for anyone but the most accomplished pianists. But Grace's grandmother had taught her this piece. It had taken her 2 years to master it, practicing every day until her fingers were sore. Grandma Ruth had called it her graduation piece, the song that proved she was truly a pianist. The music filled the room with power and emotion. Grace's left hand raced across the lower keys while her right hand carried the beautiful, haunting melody. This piece told a story of struggle and triumph, of fighting against impossible odds and refusing to give up. As she played, Grace felt tears running down her cheeks. She was remembering not just how to play, but why she had loved it so much. Music wasn't just notes on a page. It was life itself, all the pain and joy and hope wrapped up in something beautiful. She was so lost in the music that she didn't notice the figure standing in the doorway. Thomas Ashworth had been lying in bed, unable to sleep. He often had trouble sleeping, his mind too busy with thoughts and ideas to quiet down. He was composing a piece in his head when he heard the first soft notes drifting up from downstairs. At first, he thought he was imagining it. But as the music continued, he realized someone was playing the piano in the drawing room. His mother sometimes played, but never this late, and never this well. Thomas slipped out of bed and made his way downstairs, following the sound of the music. When he reached the drawing room, he stopped in amazement. Grace, the quiet young woman who served his family's meals and cleaned their house, was sitting at the piano playing with incredible skill and passion. He recognized the piece immediately. The Revolutionary Etude was one of the most challenging pieces in the classical piano repertoire. He had studied it in college but had never been able to master it himself. Yet here was Grace, playing it with technical perfection and deep emotional understanding. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, afraid to move or breathe. He had never heard anything so beautiful. Grace played as if the music was coming from her soul, as if each note was part of her heartbeat. When the last note faded into silence, the room felt empty and cold. Grace sat perfectly still for a moment, her hands resting on the keys. Then she seemed to remember where she was. She started to close the piano cover, moving quickly and quietly. That was incredible. Grace spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. Thomas stood in the doorway wearing a simple shirt and trousers, his dark hair messy from bed. His face showed no anger, only wonder. "Mr. Ashworth?" Grace gasped, standing up so quickly she almost knocked over the bench. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. I'll go right now, Please don't apologize," Thomas said, stepping into the room. "I've never heard anyone play like that. Where did you learn?" Grace looked at the floor, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "My grandmother taught me, sir, but I shouldn't have been touching your piano. I know it was wrong." "Wrong?" Thomas shook his head. "That wasn't wrong. That was extraordinary. How long have you been playing?" "I haven't played in 7 years," Grace admitted quietly. "Not since my grandmother died." Thomas stared at her in amazement. "You haven't played in 7 years, and you can still play the Revolutionary Etude perfectly?" Grace nodded, still not looking at him. "I used to practice it every day. It was my grandmother's favorite piece." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Thomas walked over to the piano and sat down on the bench. He played a few simple chords, nothing compared to what Grace had just performed. "I studied music in college," he said quietly. "I've been trying to master that piece for years. I can play it technically, but not like you just did." "You made it come alive?" Grace finally looked up at him, surprised by the kindness in his voice. "Your mother said only someone with years of training could play it." Thomas smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "My mother doesn't know everything, despite what she thinks." The next morning, Grace went about her duties as usual. She served breakfast, cleaned the rooms, and helped prepare lunch. But everything felt different now. Every time she passed Thomas in the hallway, her heart would skip a beat. Every time she entered the drawing room, she could almost hear the echo of last night's music. Thomas acted normally around his parents, but Grace caught him looking at her several times with a thoughtful expression. She wondered if he had told anyone about what he had witnessed. She wondered if her job was in danger. That afternoon, Mrs. Ashworth went out for her weekly shopping trip with her friends. Mr. Ashworth was at his office, as he was every weekday. The house was quiet except for the sound of Grace's footsteps as she dusted the furniture in the library. "Grace?" She turned around to find Thomas standing in the doorway. He looked different in the daylight, younger somehow. His eyes were kind, just as they had been the night before. "Yes, Mr. Ashworth," she said, setting down her dustcloth. "Please call me Thomas," he said, stepping into the room. "I've been thinking about last night, about what you said regarding your grandmother." Grace felt nervous. She still wasn't sure if she was going to be fired. "I promise it won't happen again, sir." Thomas, I don't want it to not happen again," Thomas said, surprising her. "I want to ask you something, but I need you to be honest with me." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. "Do you miss it?" "Playing music?" The question hit her like a physical blow. Grace had to sit down in one of the leather chairs. She had spent 7 years trying not to think about what she had lost. But in one night, all those feelings had come rushing back. "Every day," she whispered. "I miss it every single day." Thomas sat down across from her, leaning forward with interest. "Tell me about your grandmother. What was she like?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, but they were good tears this time. No one had asked her about Grandma Ruth in years. "She was everything to me," Grace said. "After my parents died, she took me in even though she didn't have much money. She worked as a piano teacher, but not for rich people. She taught kids in the neighborhood, people who couldn't afford fancy lessons." "She sounds wonderful," Thomas said gently. "She was brilliant," Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. "She could play anything just by hearing it once. She taught me that music wasn't about showing off or impressing people. She said it was about sharing something beautiful with the world." Thomas smiled. "That's exactly what you did last night. You shared something beautiful." They talked for another hour. Thomas asked about Grace's favorite pieces, about her grandmother's teaching methods, about the old piano she had learned on. Grace found herself opening up in a way she hadn't in years. Thomas listened to every word, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own experiences with music. "I have an idea," Thomas said finally, "but you have to promise to hear me out before you say no." Grace looked at him suspiciously. "What kind of idea?" "My mother is planning this piano challenge for Friday night," Thomas said. "She's invited all these young women from society families. She expects one of them to play the revolutionary etude and win the right to marry me." Grace felt her heart sink. Of course this was about the challenge. For a moment she had forgotten that Thomas was supposed to marry one of those wealthy girls. "The thing is," Thomas continued, "I don't want to marry any of them. I've met them all and they're nice enough, but we have nothing in common. They play piano because it's expected of them, not because they love it." "I don't understand what this has to do with me," Grace said quietly. Thomas leaned forward. "What if you entered the challenge?" Grace stared at him. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious," Thomas said. "You're the best pianist I've ever heard. You could play that piece better than any of them." Grace shook her head. "Thomas, that's impossible." "I'm the help. Your mother would never allow it." "My mother said any woman could try," Thomas reminded her. "She said it as a joke, but those were her exact words." "She was making fun of people like me," Grace said. "She didn't mean it, but she said it," Thomas insisted. "And I was there. I heard her." Grace stood up and started pacing around the room. This was crazy. The idea was completely insane. "Even if I wanted to do it, which I don't," she said, I haven't played seriously in 7 years. I need practice. I need time to prepare. That's where my idea comes in, Thomas said with a smile. What if I helped you? Grace stopped pacing. What do you mean? My mother goes out every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon, Thomas explained. She'll be gone for hours. We could use that time to practice. I could help you prepare, give you sheet music, work on technique. Why would you do that? Grace asked. Why would you help me when it means you might not marry one of those rich girls? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Because last night, when you were playing, I saw something I'd never seen before. You weren't playing to impress anyone or to show off your skills. You were playing because the music was part of you. That's what music should be. Grace felt tears coming to her eyes again. Your mother would be furious if she found out. My mother thinks music is about status and money, Thomas said. She doesn't understand that it's about passion and soul. Maybe it's time someone showed her the difference. That Thursday afternoon, when Mrs. Ashworth left for her regular bridge game, Thomas met Grace in the drawing room. He had brought several books of sheet music and had even made notes about technique and interpretation. Are you sure about this? Grace asked, sitting down at the piano bench. I'm sure, Thomas said. But first I want to hear you play the Revolutionary Etude again. I want to understand how you learned it. Grace began to play, and once again Thomas was amazed by her skill. Her technique was flawless, her interpretation deep and meaningful. When she finished, he shook his head in wonder. Your grandmother must have been an incredible teacher, he said. She was, Grace agreed, but she always said I had something special. She called it music in my soul. She was right, Thomas said. Now let me show you some other pieces that might impress my mother even more. Over the next few weeks, they met twice a week for secret practice sessions. Thomas taught Grace pieces she had never heard before, complex compositions that challenged her in new ways. He showed her different techniques, different ways of interpreting the music, but more than that, they became friends. They talked about books, about life, about their dreams. Grace learned that Thomas was nothing like his mother. He was kind and thoughtful, more interested in art and literature than money and status. What do you want to do with your life? Thomas asked her one day as they finished practicing a difficult Liszt piece. Grace was quiet for a moment. I used to dream of studying music seriously, she said. Maybe even teaching someday like my grandmother. But that's not realistic for someone like me. Why not? Thomas asked. You're more talented than most of the people who get to study music professionally. Because I don't have money or connections, Grace said simply. The world doesn't work that way for people like me. Thomas looked thoughtful. Maybe it's time to change the way the world works. As Friday approached, Grace felt more nervous than ever. She had been practicing for weeks, and she knew she could play the Revolutionary Etude perfectly. She could probably play it better than any of the wealthy girls who would be at the dinner party. But the question remained, would she actually have the courage to sit down at that piano in front of all those people and prove that talent had nothing to do with money or social status? You don't have to do this, Thomas told her on Thursday afternoon, their last practice session before the challenge. I don't want you to feel pressured. Grace looked at the piano, then at Thomas's encouraging face. She thought about her grandmother, about all the lessons and all the love that had gone into her musical education. Yes, I do have to do this, she said finally. Not for you and not to prove anything to your mother. I have to do it for Grandma Ruth. She always told me that talent was a gift that should be shared with the world. Thomas smiled. Then tomorrow night we'll give her gift the audience it deserves. Friday evening arrived like a storm cloud on the horizon. Grace had barely slept the night before, her mind racing with doubts and fears. What if she forgot the music? What if her hands shook too badly to play? What if she humiliated herself in front of all those important people? She spent the day helping prepare for the dinner party. The house was transformed into something even more elegant than usual. Fresh flowers filled every room. The finest china and silverware were laid out, and everything was polished to perfection. Grace worked quietly, trying to calm her nerves. By evening, guests began arriving. Grace watched from the kitchen window as expensive cars pulled up to the front door. Well-dressed women stepped out, their jewelry sparkling under the lights. These were the daughters of the wealthiest families in the city, each one hoping to impress Mrs. Ashworth and win the chance to marry Thomas. Grace changed into her best dress, a simple navy blue outfit that she had bought 2 years ago for a cousin's wedding. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and respectable. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her room. Her hands were trembling. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. "Grandma Ruth believed in you. Thomas believes in you. Now you have to believe in yourself." The dinner seemed to last forever. Grace served each course, moving silently around the elegant dining room. She listened to the conversations, the polite chatter about society events and family connections. The 5 young women at the table were exactly what Mrs. Ashworth wanted for her son. Wealthy, educated, and from the right families. There was Rebecca Wellington, whose father owned half the banks in the city. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, and she wore a dress that probably cost more than Grace made in 6 months. She spoke confidently about her piano training, mentioning famous teachers and expensive schools. Elizabeth Morrison sat next to her, equally polished and proper. She had graduated from a prestigious music conservatory and carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never been told she couldn't have something she wanted. The other 3 young women were similar, wealthy, educated, and completely sure of their place in the world. They spoke about music the way they spoke about everything else, as if it was something they owned rather than something they felt. Thomas was polite during dinner, but Grace could tell he wasn't enjoying himself. He answered questions and made conversation, but his heart wasn't in it. Several times Grace caught him looking at her with encouraging eyes, as if reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. After dinner, everyone moved to the drawing room. The piano had been prepared for the evening, its surface gleaming under the chandelier. Mrs. Ashworth stood beside it, her face glowing with excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "tonight we will witness something very special. These 5 accomplished young women will each perform Chopin's Revolutionary Etude. The one who plays it most successfully will have proven herself worthy of joining our family." The guests applauded politely. Grace stood in the corner with the other household staff, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Rebecca went first. She approached the piano with complete confidence, sat down at the bench, and began to play. Her technique was good, her posture perfect. She had clearly spent years studying with expensive teachers. But something was missing. The music was correct but cold, like reading words from a book without understanding their meaning. She made it through most of the piece before stumbling on one of the more difficult passages. She stopped, apologized with a laugh, and started that section again. This time she finished it, but the magic was lost. The guests applauded politely when she was done. "Very nice, dear," Mrs. Ashworth said, though Grace could tell she was disappointed. Elizabeth went next. Her performance was similar, technically proficient but emotionally empty. She played the notes correctly, but she didn't make them sing. She too stumbled in places and had to restart sections. The 3rd and 4th contestants fared even worse. One of them stopped completely halfway through, shaking her head and admitting she couldn't continue. The other made so many mistakes that the beautiful piece became almost unrecognizable. The 5th young woman, Catherine Brooks, was the most accomplished of the group. She had studied at a conservatory in Europe and played with real skill. Her performance was smooth and confident. When she finished, the guests gave her genuine applause. "Excellent," Mrs. Ashworth said, clapping her hands. "Simply excellent, my dear. You have clearly mastered this challenging piece." Grace felt her heart sink. Catherine had played well, not with the passion and depth that Grace remembered from her grandmother's lessons, but well enough to satisfy Mrs. Ashworth and her guests. "I believe we have our winner," Mrs. Ashworth announced. "Catherine, my dear, you have—" "Wait." Everyone turned to look at Thomas, who had stood up from his chair. His face was serious, but his eyes were determined. "Mother, you said that any woman could attempt this challenge," he said calmly. "Those were your exact words." Mrs. Ashworth looked confused. "Yes, dear, but all the contestants have performed." "Catherine clearly—" "Not all the women have performed," Thomas interrupted. "You said any woman in the city could try. You even mentioned the household staff." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter went through the room. Mrs. Ashworth's face turned red. "Thomas, dear, I was joking about that. Surely you don't expect—" "I expect you to keep your word, Mother," Thomas said firmly. "You made a promise in front of witnesses. Any woman who can play this piece successfully has the right to be considered." Grace felt all the eyes in the room turn toward her. Her legs felt like water, and for a moment she thought she might faint. This was it. This was the moment she had been preparing for, but now that it was here, she was terrified. Mrs. Ashworth looked horrified. "This is ridiculous. The help cannot possibly. Let me try." Grace's voice was quiet, but in the shocked silence of the room, everyone heard her clearly. She stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her to hide their trembling. "I said, let me try," Grace repeated, her voice growing stronger. The room erupted in whispers and gasps. Some of the guests looked scandalized, others curious. Mrs. Ashworth looked like she had been slapped. "This is outrageous," she sputtered. "I will not have the hired help making a mockery of this evening." "She's not making a mockery of anything," Thomas said, moving to stand beside Grace. "She's accepting the challenge that you offered. Unless, of course, you're going back on your word." Mrs. Ashworth was trapped, and she knew it. She had made the offer publicly, in front of all her friends. To refuse now would make her look foolish and dishonest. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "But when this person fails miserably, I don't want to hear any complaints about wasted time." Grace walked to the piano on unsteady legs. The room was completely silent now, everyone waiting to see what would happen. She sat down on the bench and looked at the keys. They seemed to shimmer in the light like old friends welcoming her home. She placed her hands on the keys and closed her eyes for just a moment. She thought about her grandmother, about all those evenings spent at the old piano, about the love and patience that had gone into every lesson. "This is for you, Grandma Ruth," she whispered. Then Grace began to play. The first notes filled the room like thunder. But this wasn't the cold, technical performance the guests had heard before. This was music that came from the soul, music that told a story of struggle and triumph, of pain transformed into beauty. Grace's left hand raced across the lower keys while her right hand carried the soaring melody. Every note was perfect, but more than that, every note had meaning. The music filled the room with emotion so powerful that several people in the audience began to cry. This was the revolutionary etude as Chopin had meant it to be played, not as a display of technical skill, but as a cry of the human heart against injustice and oppression. When the last note faded into silence, the room remained quiet for a long moment. Then slowly Thomas began to clap. One by one, the other guests joined in, until the room was filled with thunderous applause. The applause seemed to go on forever. Grace sat at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, hardly believing what had just happened. She had done it. She had played the revolutionary etude in front of all these important people, and they were clapping for her. But when she looked up at Mrs. Ashworth, her heart sank. The older woman's face was white with shock and something that looked like anger. Her mouth was open, but no words were coming out. The applause continued around them, but Mrs. Ashworth seemed frozen in place. "Mother," Thomas said, moving closer to his mother. "Did you hear that?" Grace played it perfectly. Mrs. Ashworth blinked several times as if waking up from a bad dream. She looked at Grace, then at the guests who were still clapping, then back at Grace again. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How is this possible?" Grace stood up from the piano bench slowly. Her legs were still shaking, but now it was from excitement rather than fear. She had found her way back to the music, back to the part of herself she had lost 7 years ago. "Mrs. Ashworth," Grace said quietly, "I learned to play from my grandmother. She taught me for 10 years before she died." "Your grandmother?" Mrs. Ashworth repeated as if the words didn't make sense. "Ruth Thompson," Grace said, her voice growing stronger. "She was a piano teacher before she retired. She studied at the conservatory downtown back in the 1940s. Mrs. Patterson, one of the Tea Party ladies, gasped suddenly. "Ruth Thompson? Did you say Ruth Thompson?" Grace turned to look at her. "Yes, ma'am. Did you know her?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes were wide with amazement. "Know her? My dear child, Ruth Thompson was one of the most talented pianists of her generation. She was supposed to perform with the City Symphony, but then—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "But then what?" Thomas asked. Mrs. Patterson glanced around the room nervously. "Well, this was back in the 1940s. Things were different then. There were certain barriers that prevented talented people from getting the opportunities they deserved." The room fell silent as everyone understood what she meant. Grace felt a flutter of pride mixed with sadness. Her grandmother had never told her about any of this. She had only spoken about teaching neighborhood children and sharing her love of music. "Ruth Thompson," Mrs. Wellington said suddenly. "I remember that name now. My own piano teacher used to speak of her with great respect. She said Ruth was one of the finest musicians she ever heard. Mrs. Ashworth looked around the room, seeing the faces of her friends as they nodded and murmured their agreement. She turned back to Grace with a completely different expression, as if seeing her for the first time. "You're Ruth Thompson's granddaughter," she said softly. "Yes, ma'am," Grace replied. "She raised me after my parents died. She taught me everything I know about music. And you've been working in my house for 3 years," Mrs. Ashworth continued, more to herself than to anyone else. "You've been serving my tea and cleaning my rooms, and all this time you could play like that?" Grace nodded. "I haven't played seriously since she died. Until recently, I had almost forgotten how much I missed it." Thomas stepped forward with a smile. "Grace has been practicing again these past few weeks. She's as talented as any musician I've ever heard." Mrs. Ashworth looked at her son, then back at Grace. Something was changing in her expression. "Like ice melting in the spring sun. Why didn't you ever say anything?" she asked Grace. "Why didn't you tell me about your musical background?" Grace took a deep breath. "Because I didn't think it mattered to you. I thought you only cared about music when it came from people with money and status." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Mrs. Ashworth opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She looked around at her guests, at her son, at the piano that had just been transformed by Grace's music. "You're right," she said quietly. "I did think that. I thought talent was something that could only exist in certain families, in certain social circles. I was wrong." The room was completely silent now. Everyone could tell that something important was happening, something that went beyond a simple piano competition. Mrs. Ashworth walked slowly over to Grace. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I have misjudged you terribly. I have misjudged what really matters." Grace felt tears starting to form in her eyes. "You don't need to apologize, Mrs. Ashworth." "Yes, I do," the older woman insisted. "I've spent so much time worrying about status and connections that I almost missed recognizing real talent when it was right in front of me." She turned to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we have all witnessed something extraordinary. We have seen that true musical genius has nothing to do with money or social standing. It comes from somewhere much deeper." Catherine Brooks, the young woman who had played well earlier, stood up from her chair. "Mrs. Ashworth is right," she said. "I've studied piano for 15 years, and I've never heard anything as beautiful as what Grace just played. She didn't just play the notes. She made them come alive." Other guests murmured their agreement. Grace looked around the room in amazement. These wealthy, important people were all looking at her with respect and admiration. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked. Grace clearly won the challenge. Mrs. Ashworth looked thoughtful. "Yes, she did win the challenge. But I don't think marriage was ever really the point, was it? I think this was about recognizing true worth when we see it." She turned to Grace. "My dear, I have a proposition for you. But first I need to ask you something. What do you want to do with your musical gift?" Grace was quiet for a moment, thinking about the question she had buried for so many years. "I used to dream of studying music seriously," she said slowly. "Maybe even teaching someday like my grandmother did. But I never thought it was possible for someone like me." "Someone like you?" Mrs. Ashworth repeated. "You mean someone with extraordinary talent and a deep love for music?" Grace smiled through her tears. "I guess I never thought about it that way." Mrs. Ashworth nodded firmly. "Well, it's time you started thinking about it that way. I have friends on the board of the conservatory downtown, the same conservatory where your grandmother studied all those years ago." "Mrs. Ashworth," Grace said, hardly daring to hope. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that talent like yours shouldn't be wasted," Mrs. Ashworth replied. "I'm saying that I would like to help you get the musical education you deserve. A full scholarship, if that's what you want." Grace felt like the room was spinning around her. "You would do that for me?" "It's the least I can do," Mrs. Ashworth said. "Consider it an investment in what really matters. Not social status or family connections, but genuine talent and passion." Thomas was beaming with pride. "Grace, this is wonderful. You'll finally be able to study music the way you always dreamed." Grace looked around the room at all these people who had seemed so foreign and intimidating just hours ago. Now they were smiling at her, celebrating her success, recognizing her worth. "There's just one condition," Mrs. Ashworth added. Grace felt her heart skip a beat. "What condition?" Mrs. Ashworth smiled, and for the first time since Grace had known her, the smile reached her eyes. "When you become a famous pianist, I want you to remember this evening." I want you to remember that talent can come from anywhere, and that everyone deserves a chance to share their gifts with the world." Grace nodded, unable to speak through her tears of joy. "And," Mrs. Ashworth continued, "I want you to teach that lesson to others, just like your grandmother taught it to you." As the evening ended and the guests began to leave, they each stopped to shake Grace's hand and tell her how moved they had been by her performance. Mrs. Patterson even asked if Grace might consider giving piano lessons to her own granddaughter someday. Later, after everyone had gone home, Grace sat alone in the drawing room with the piano. Thomas found her there just as he had that first night weeks ago. "How does it feel?" he asked, sitting down beside her on the bench. Grace placed her hands on the keys and played a soft, simple melody, the first song her grandmother had ever taught her. "It feels like coming home," she said. "Like I'm finally where I belong." "Your grandmother would be proud," Thomas said. Grace smiled, thinking about Grandma Ruth and all the love and wisdom she had shared. "She always told me that music was meant to be shared with the world. I think she would be happy to know that her lessons are finally reaching a bigger audience." She played the melody again, and in the quiet notes, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice saying what she had said so many years ago. "You have a gift, child. Don't you ever let anyone tell you otherwise." Tonight, Grace had finally learned to believe it.